The dust had turned her dress from blue to brown, and Hannah Ashford's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she stood outside the bank that had just foreclosed on everything she had left in this world. She'd been standing there for nearly an hour, unable to move forward or back, her mother's locket clutched so tightly in her palm that the metal edge had cut into her skin, a thin line of blood mixing with the dirt already caked there. White River, South Dakota in the summer of 1883, was unforgiving to those who couldn't keep up, and Hannah had fallen so far behind she couldn't see the path anymore. Her father had died 3 months ago from pneumonia. Her younger brother Samuel had been kicked by a horse 2 weeks after that, and never woke up, and her mother had simply stopped eating until her heart gave out last Tuesday. The ranch they'd worked for 15 years was gone, sold to pay debts Hannah hadn't even known existed. Everything her father had told her about their financial situation had been a lie wrapped in protection, and now she stood with $7 to her name, a carpet bag of clothes, and nowhere to go. The sun beat down mercilessly as people passed her on the wooden sidewalk, their eyes sliding away from her distress like water off oilcloth. She supposed she looked like trouble, and nobody in White River had extra sympathy to spare. The town had grown harder over the past few years as the cattle industry shifted and the railroad brought in more competition. Everyone was fighting for their own survival. Hannah finally forced her feet to move, walking toward the general store where she'd worked occasionally when her mother needed medicine. Maybe Mrs. Patterson would let her sleep in the back room for a few nights while she figured out what to do. The alternative was the boarding house, but that would eat through her $7 in less than a week. And then what? She'd heard stories about women with no money and no family, about the choices they had to make, and her stomach turned over at the thought. She was so lost in her spiraling thoughts that she didn't notice the man on horseback until he was right beside her. "Miss Ashford." Hannah looked up, squinting against the sun. The man sat astride a large bay gelding, his hat pulled low enough that she couldn't make out his features clearly. But she recognized the voice. James Irving, one of the ranch hands who worked for the Double J, spread about 10 miles north of town. She'd met him a handful of times when he'd come into town for supplies, had noticed the way he always tipped his hat politely, the way his eyes were kind even when his face stayed serious. "Mr. Irving," she managed, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. He dismounted in one fluid motion, looping his horse's reins over the hitching post. Now that he was standing in front of her, she could see his face properly. He was perhaps 25, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the prairie, and right now they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I heard about your mother," he said quietly. "I'm real sorry. That's a heavy load of grief for one person to carry." Hannah's throat tightened. She'd been holding everything in so tightly for so long that simple kindness felt like a crowbar prying her apart. "Thank you," she whispered. James glanced at the bank, then at the carpet bag she was holding, and his expression shifted into something that looked like understanding. "You got somewhere to stay tonight? I'm working on it." "That means no." It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. "There's a bench over there in front of the hotel. Would you sit with me for a minute? I'd like to talk to you about something." Hannah knew she should be cautious. An unmarried woman sitting with a man she barely knew would set tongues wagging, but she was so tired of standing, tired of holding herself together, tired of pretending she had any idea how to survive this. She nodded. They walked to the bench and sat down, leaving a respectable distance between them. James took off his hat and set it on his knee, running a hand through his hair. Up close, Hannah could see the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the way his shirt was faded but clean and carefully mended. A working man who took pride in himself. "I don't mean to be forward," James started, "but I know you're in a bad situation. The whole town knows by now." News travels fast in a place this size. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks, shame mixing with anger. "I'll figure something out." "I'm sure you would, given time, but time costs money you don't have." He turned to face her more fully. "I have a proposition for you, and I want you to hear me out before you answer. Can you do that?" She nodded warily. "I own a piece of land about 15 miles west of here. Bought it 2 years ago with money I'd been saving since I was 16. It's not much yet, just a small cabin and a barn, about 50 head of cattle, some chickens. I've been building it up slow and steady, doing it right. But it's lonely work, and a man on his own can only do so much." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm looking for a wife, Miss Ashford. A partner, someone who's not afraid of hard work, who understands what it takes to build something from nothing." Hannah's eyes widened. She'd expected him to offer her a job as a housekeeper, maybe a cook. Not this. "You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you worked that ranch with your family without complaint. I know you took care of your mother when she was sick. I know you're standing here trying to figure out how to survive instead of falling apart, even though you've got every right to. That tells me you've got backbone." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not talking about love, if that's what's worrying you. I'm talking about a practical arrangement between two people who could help each other. You need a home and security. I need help building my ranch into something that can last. We could do that together." "You're asking me to marry you." Hannah's voice sounded distant to her own ears, like she was listening to someone else speak. "I'm asking you to consider it. I won't rush you for an answer. You can come out to the ranch, see the place, see if you think you could make a life there. If you decide it's not for you, I'll bring you back to town and give you enough money to get to Denver or Cheyenne, somewhere with more opportunities for work." He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentler. "But Hannah, I want you to know something. If you say yes, I'll treat you with respect. I'll work beside you, not above you. I'll make sure you always have what you need. And I'll never raise a hand to you or speak cruel words. That's a promise." Hannah stared at him, her mind reeling. Marriage to a virtual stranger. It sounded insane. But what were her other options, Mrs. Patterson might let her stay a few nights. But then what? She could try to find work as a laundress or a seamstress, but those jobs barely paid enough to keep body and soul together. She could try to travel to one of the bigger cities, but $7 wouldn't get her far, and she'd be just as alone there as she was here. At least James Irving was offering her a choice. At least he was being honest about what he wanted. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He stood up, settling his hat back on his head. "I'm staying at the boarding house tonight, heading back to the ranch tomorrow around noon. If you want to see the place, meet me at the livery stable before then. If I don't see you, I'll understand." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, leading his horse down the street toward the boarding house. Hannah sat on the bench, watching him go, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. She spent that night in the back room of the general store, just as she'd hoped. Mrs. Patterson had taken one look at her face and ushered her inside, fed her soup and bread, and made up a cot among the dry goods. But Hannah barely slept. She kept thinking about James's offer, turning it over and over in her mind like a stone. By morning, she'd made her decision. She found him at the livery stable at 11:30, her carpet bag repacked with everything she owned. He looked up from checking his horse's hooves, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her. Relief mixed with something else she couldn't quite name. "I'd like to see your ranch," Hannah said. James nodded. I've got a horse saddled for you. She's gentle, good for riding." They rode out of White River side by side, and Hannah watched the town disappear behind them with a strange mixture of fear and relief. Whatever happened next, at least she was moving forward instead of standing paralyzed on the sidewalk. The ride took just over an hour. James pointed out landmarks as they went, showing her where the property boundaries were, explaining the geography of the land. His ranch sat in a small valley with a creek running through it, protected from the worst of the winter winds by a line of hills to the north. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from logs with a stone chimney. The barn was newer, the wood still pale and unstained by weather. "I built the barn first," James explained as they dismounted. "Figured the livestock needed shelter more than I did. Spent my first winter here sleeping in the hayloft." Hannah walked around slowly, taking everything in. There was a vegetable garden behind the cabin, currently overgrown with weeds. A chicken coop with about a dozen hens scratching in the dirt. The cabin itself had 2 rooms, she discovered when James opened the door. The main room held a stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair by the fireplace. The bedroom was barely big enough for the narrow bed and a chest of drawers, but it was clean and the roof looked solid. "It's not much," James said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "But it's mine. Well, the bank owns part of it still, but I'm making the payments regular. Another 3 years and it'll be clear." "It's honest," Hannah said, running her hand along the smooth wood of the table. "You built this yourself, most of it. Had help with the barn raising, traded work with some of the other ranchers in the area." He watched her carefully. "What do you think?" Hannah looked around the small cabin, imagining what it could be. Curtains on the windows, rugs on the floor, the garden weeded and producing food. A life small and simple, but hers. Safe. "I think it could be a good home," she said softly. "Does that mean you're saying yes?" She turned to face him, her heart pounding. This was insane. She barely knew this man, but he'd been honest with her and he was offering her something she desperately needed. A chance. "Yes," Hannah said, "I'll marry you." James's whole face changed, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thank you. I'll make sure you don't regret it." He cleared his throat. "We should probably talk about the practical details. I'll sleep in the barn until after the wedding. We can ride back to town tomorrow and talk to the preacher, get it done quick and legal, unless you want something fancier." Hannah almost laughed. Fancier. She had no family to invite, no friends who'd care enough to attend. Quick and legal sounds fine. All right then. James looked around the cabin as if seeing it fresh. "I'll cook us some supper, you must be hungry." They ate beans and cornbread at the small table as the sun set outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The silence between them was awkward but not uncomfortable. James asked her questions about what she'd need, what supplies they should buy in town, whether she knew how to can vegetables and make preserves. Practical questions about building a life together. That night, Hannah slept in the cabin's bedroom while James made good on his word and bedded down in the barn. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Yesterday morning she'd been standing outside the bank with nothing. Tonight she was in a cabin that would soon be her home, promised to a man she'd marry within days. It should have terrified her. Maybe it did. But beneath the fear was something else, a tiny spark of hope. They rode back to White River the next morning. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, agreed to marry them that very afternoon with Mrs. Patterson and her husband standing as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Hannah wore the same dust-covered blue dress she'd been wearing for days. James had changed into a clean shirt, but otherwise looked exactly as he had. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, James squeezed her hand gently, and Hannah squeezed back. They bought supplies with money James had saved, loading up flour and sugar and coffee, fabric for curtains and a new dress for Hannah, seeds for the garden. James insisted she pick out anything she wanted within reason, and Hannah found herself choosing carefully, aware that every dollar spent was a dollar they'd need to work to replace. On the ride back to the ranch, now as husband and wife, James was quieter than he'd been before. Hannah wondered if he was having second thoughts, if the reality of what they'd done was settling in. But when they reached the cabin and he helped her down from her horse, his touch was steady and sure. "I'll move my things back inside," he said. "We should probably talk about sleeping arrangements." Hannah's stomach tightened. She'd been trying not to think about that part. "All right." James led her inside and gestured to the bedroom. "That bed's barely big enough for one person, let alone two. I was thinking I could build a bigger frame, but that'll take some time. Until then, I can sleep out here by the fire if that's more comfortable for you." "We're married," Hannah said, though her voice shook slightly. "People will expect us to share a bed. I don't care much what people expect. This is about what makes you comfortable." James's eyes were serious. "Hannah, I meant what I said. I won't push you into anything you're not ready for. We barely know each other. If you need time, we've got nothing but time." Relief flooded through her so strongly she almost swayed. "Thank you." "So the fire then. I'll be plenty warm and you'll have your privacy." Hannah nodded, not trusting her voice. They fell into a routine over the next few weeks. James woke before dawn to tend the cattle and horses. Hannah cooked breakfast, worked in the garden, fed the chickens, cleaned the cabin. They ate their meals together, worked side by side on projects around the ranch, and talked about practical things. The weather, the livestock, what needed fixing or building. Hannah learned that James had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 6 children. His father had been a farmer who drank too much, and his mother had died when he was 12. He'd left home at 16 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to make something of himself. He'd worked as a ranch hand for nearly a decade, saving every penny he could spare, learning everything there was to know about raising cattle and managing land. "I wanted something that was mine," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Something nobody could take away from me as long as I worked hard and paid my debts. This ranch is that. It's not big or fancy, but it's mine. Ours now, I suppose." Hannah told him about her own family in return. About her father's dreams of building a cattle empire, dreams that had stayed dreams until the day he died. About Samuel, who'd been 14 and full of life until the horse kicked him. About her mother, who'd simply given up when the grief became too heavy to carry. "I was so angry at her," Hannah admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "For leaving me. For not trying harder to stay. I know that's awful to say about my own mother, but I felt so abandoned. It's not awful. It's honest." James's voice was quiet in the gathering dark. "Grief does strange things to people. Some fight through it and some let it take them under. Neither choice is wrong, just different." Hannah found herself relaxing around him more as the days passed. James was patient and steady, never demanding more from her than she was ready to give. He'd built a new bed frame, twice the size of the old one, and they'd started sharing the bedroom. But he always stayed on his side, giving her space, waiting. One night, about 6 weeks after their wedding, Hannah woke from a nightmare about the bank foreclosure. In the dream, she'd been buried under stacks of papers, suffocating, unable to breathe. She sat up gasping, her heart racing, and felt James stir beside her. "Hannah, you all right? Just a bad dream?" She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warm summer night. James sat up too, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence. You want to talk about it." And suddenly, she did. She wanted to talk about all of it. The fear, the grief, the crushing weight of loss that she'd been carrying alone for so long. The words started pouring out of her in the darkness, everything she'd been holding back, and James just listened. He didn't interrupt or try to fix anything. He just sat there and listened until she'd said everything she needed to say. When she finally stopped talking, her throat raw and her eyes burning with unshed tears, James spoke quietly. "That's a hell of a lot for one person to carry. I'm glad you told me. I didn't want to burden you with it. Hannah, we're partners. Your burdens are my burdens now. That's what this is supposed to be." He hesitated, then asked, "Can I hold you? Just hold you, nothing else. I think you could use it." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and James carefully put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. Hannah let herself lean into him, let herself take comfort from his solid warmth, and for the first time since her father died, she cried. Really cried, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. James held her through all of it, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, murmuring quiet reassurances. "I've got you. Let it out. I've got you." When the storm finally passed and Hannah lay exhausted against his chest, James pressed a kiss to the top of her head. It was the first time he'd kissed her since their wedding, where he'd given her a chaste peck on the cheek that barely counted. "Better?" he asked softly. "Yes," Hannah whispered. "Thank you. Nothing to thank me for." But his arm tightened around her just slightly, and Hannah felt something shift between them. A wall coming down, a connection forming. They stayed like that for a long time, Hannah's head on James's shoulder, his arm around her. Eventually she felt herself drifting back towards sleep, but this time it felt safe instead of frightening. "James," she murmured. "Yeah, I'm glad I married you." She felt him smile against her hair. "I'm glad too, Hannah, real glad." The next morning, things felt different between them. The awkwardness had burned away, replaced by something warmer and more genuine. James caught her eye over breakfast and smiled, and Hannah smiled back without thinking about it. Over the following weeks, they grew closer. James started teaching Hannah to ride better, taking her out to check on the cattle with him. She loved being out on the prairie, the endless sky stretching overhead, the grass rippling in the wind like an ocean. James would point out different plants and animals, sharing the knowledge he'd accumulated over years of working the land. Hannah, in turn, transformed the cabin into a real home. She sewed curtains from the fabric they'd bought, made rag rugs for the floors, planted herbs in pots by the door. She learned to make bread that rose properly and stew that didn't burn. The garden flourished under her care, producing tomatoes and beans and squash. They worked together to build a chicken run, digging post holes and stringing wire. James was patient when Hannah hit her thumb with the hammer, cleaning the blood and wrapping it in clean cloth. Hannah was patient when James got frustrated with a piece of wire that wouldn't cooperate, talking him through his anger until he could laugh at himself. One afternoon in late August, they were working together to repair a section of fence when a summer storm rolled in fast. The sky went from blue to black in minutes, and the wind picked up with a vengeance. "We need to get to shelter," James shouted over the rising wind. "Leave the tools. We'll come back for them." They ran for the cabin, but the rain hit before they made it, drenching them both in seconds. By the time they stumbled through the door, they were soaked to the skin and laughing breathlessly at the absurdity of it. Hannah tried to wring out her braid and succeeded only in getting more water on the floor. James peeled off his soaked shirt and hung it by the stove, then turned to help Hannah with her boots, which had gotten stuck on her feet. "Hold still," he said, kneeling in front of her and tugging at the stubborn leather. "These things have shrunk up like nobody's business." "Just cut them off," Hannah suggested, still giggling. These are your only boots. We're not cutting them." He gave another firm tug and the boot came free, sending him backwards onto his rear end. Hannah laughed harder, reaching down to help him up. But when their hands met, the laughter faded. They were standing very close, both dripping wet, both breathing hard. James's eyes searched her face, asking a question he didn't voice. Hannah answered by leaning forward and kissing him. It was tentative at first, uncertain, but James responded immediately, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. The kiss deepened, and Hannah felt heat flood through her that had nothing to do with the stove. When they finally broke apart, both of them were flushed and breathing harder than before. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," James admitted, his voice rough. "Why didn't you?" "Didn't want to push, wanted you to be ready." His thumb traced along her cheekbone. "Are you ready, Hannah?" She nodded, then reconsidered. "I think so. I'm nervous, but I want this. I want you." "We'll go slow," James promised. "And if you want to stop at any point, we stop. Deal, deal." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. Then he scooped her up in his arms, making her squeal in surprise, and carried her to the bedroom. Outside, the storm raged, rain hammering on the roof and wind howling around the cabin. But inside, Hannah felt safe and cherished as James laid her down on the bed they'd been sharing and proceeded to show her, with gentle hands and patient kisses, what it meant to be loved. After, they lay tangled together under the quilt, listening to the storm fade. Hannah traced patterns on James's chest, marveling at how comfortable she felt, how right this seemed. "I never thought I'd have this," she said quietly. "After everything fell apart, I thought I'd lost my chance at happiness." James caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "You were about to break under all of it. I could see it that day in town. That's why I sat down with you and asked you to tell me everything you need. I wanted to help if I could." Hannah propped herself up on one elbow to look at him properly. "You saved me, you know. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't offered me a way out. You would have figured something out. You're stronger than you think." James tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "But I'm real glad I asked. I'm real glad you said yes." Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being a practical arrangement and started being something real. "I love you," Hannah said, the words coming easily and naturally. "I don't know exactly when it happened, but I love you, James Irving." His whole face lit up with a joy so pure it made her chest ache. "I love you too, Hannah Irving. Have for a while now, if I'm being honest. Maybe from that first day when you were trying so hard to be brave even though your whole world had collapsed." They kissed again, sweet and slow, and Hannah felt the last of her walls crumble. She'd gone into this marriage out of desperation, but she was staying in it out of love. As summer faded into autumn, their love grew deeper and stronger. They worked the ranch together as true partners, making decisions jointly, supporting each other through the hard days and celebrating the good ones. James taught Hannah to rope cattle, and she turned out to have a natural talent for it. Hannah taught James to appreciate small luxuries like wildflowers on the table and reading aloud in the evenings. They attended church in White River on Sundays when the weather permitted, and Hannah noticed the way people's attitudes toward her had shifted. She was no longer the pitiful orphan with nothing. She was Mrs. Irving, wife of a hard-working rancher, a woman with a home and a future. It felt good to walk through town with her head held high, James's hand steady at her back. In October, one of the neighboring ranchers, a gruff man named Peterson who owned the spread to the east, stopped by to talk to James about going in together on buying a new bull. Hannah served them coffee and pie, then excused herself to work in the garden. But she could hear their voices through the open window. "You did all right for yourself, Irving," Peterson was saying. "That wife of yours is a hard worker, pretty too." "I know it," James replied, and Hannah could hear the pride in his voice. I'm a lucky man. Heard she was the Ashford girl, the one whose family all died off last spring. That right, that's right. Took a risk marrying a woman in that situation. Some would say she was desperate, might not be in it for the right reasons. There was a long pause. Then James spoke, his voice hard in a way Hannah had never heard before. With all due respect, Peterson, my marriage is my business. Hannah is here because we chose each other, and we're building a good life together. Anyone who wants to suggest otherwise can take their opinions elsewhere. Didn't mean no offense, just making conversation. Then let's talk about that bull instead. Hannah stood in the garden, her hands full of carrots, and smiled. James defended her. He stood up for her. He loved her. That night she told him she'd overheard, and James looked embarrassed. I shouldn't have been so sharp with him. Peterson's all right, just doesn't think before he talks sometimes. I'm glad you said what you said. It made me feel protected. Hannah moved into his arms, resting her head against his chest. I never had that before. My father loved me, but he hid things from me, tried to shield me instead of trusting me with the truth. You're different. You tell me the truth, but you also stand beside me, with me. James kissed the top of her head. Always will, Hannah. You're mine and I'm yours, and that's how it's going to stay. Winter came hard and fast that year. By November, the snow was piling up and the temperatures were dropping well below freezing. James had spent the autumn preparing as best he could, stocking up on hay for the cattle, chopping firewood, sealing cracks in the cabin walls. But nature was unforgiving, and there were days when they couldn't leave the cabin at all, when the wind howled so fiercely that visibility dropped to nothing. Those days, trapped inside together, they learned each other even more deeply. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and fears. James told her about his childhood, about watching his father drink away everything his mother had worked for, about the helplessness he'd felt. Hannah told him about the loneliness of being an only surviving child after Samuel died, about the guilt she felt for being angry at her mother. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel, James told her firmly. Grief isn't clean or pretty. It's messy and complicated, and sometimes you feel things that don't make sense. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. They made love often during those long winter days, learning each other's bodies as thoroughly as they'd learned each other's hearts. Sometimes it was passionate and urgent, seeking warmth and connection against the brutal cold outside. Sometimes it was slow and tender, a reaffirmation of the promises they'd made to each other. On Christmas Eve, James surprised Hannah with a gift he'd been working on in secret. It was a rocking chair, beautifully made with smooth, curved runners and a high back carved with a pattern of flowers. For when we have children, he said, watching her face anxiously. I know we haven't talked about that much, but I was hoping maybe someday. Hannah ran her hands over the smooth wood, tears pricking her eyes. It's beautiful, James, and yes, someday I'd like that very much. He pulled her into his arms, relief and joy evident on his face. I'll be a good father, Hannah, I swear it. I'll be nothing like my old man. I know you will. You're the best man I've ever known. They spent Christmas Day together, just the two of them, and Hannah realized she didn't miss having a big family celebration. This was enough. This was everything. The winter tested them in ways they hadn't expected. In January, a particularly brutal cold snap killed 3 of their cattle, a financial blow that stung. James took it hard, blaming himself for not bringing them closer to the barn, for not doing more to protect them. Hannah found him in the barn that night, sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands. She sat down beside him and took his hand. We'll recover from this, she said quietly. It's a setback, but it's not the end. Those were 3 head we were counting on for income. That's 3 calves we won't have this spring, I know. But we still have 47 healthy cattle, we have chickens and horses, we have each other. She squeezed his hand. You told me once that some people fight through grief and hardship and some let it take them under. You're a fighter, James, we both are. We'll figure this out together. He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. When did you get so strong? When I married a man who believed I could be. James pulled her close, holding her tight. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. We deserve each other. We deserve the life we're building. They sat together in the barn for a long time, drawing strength from each other, and when they finally went back to the cabin, they were ready to face whatever came next. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with it came new life. The cattle that survived the winter produced healthy calves. The garden, planted as soon as the ground thawed, began to grow. And Hannah, who'd been feeling tired and queasy for weeks, finally accepted what her body had been trying to tell her. She was pregnant. She told James one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, not saying anything. Then a grin spread across his face so wide it looked like it might split him in half. Really? You're sure? As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. But yes, I'm sure. James let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. We're going to have a baby. Hannah, we're going to be parents. He set her down carefully, suddenly concerned. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you be doing heavy work? Hannah laughed at his anxious expression. I'm pregnant, not fragile. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I'll be fine. But James fussed over her anyway, insisting she rest more, taking on extra chores to spare her the heavy lifting. Hannah found it endearing even when it was annoying. He was going to be an incredibly devoted father. They rode into White River to see the doctor, who confirmed what Hannah already knew. She was about 3 months along, which meant the baby would arrive in late October or early November. The doctor gave her advice about diet and rest, warned her about danger signs to watch for, and sent them home with instructions to come back if anything seemed wrong. As they rode home, Hannah felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. A year ago, she'd been standing outside that bank with nothing and no one. Now she had a husband she loved, a home that was truly hers, and a baby on the way. Life could change so quickly, for better or worse. What are you thinking about? James asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. About how much can change in a year, about how lucky I am. We're both lucky. James reached over and took her hand. I love you, Hannah, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I love you too. The summer was busy with preparations for the baby and the usual ranch work. Hannah sewed tiny clothes and blankets while James built a cradle from the same wood he'd used for the rocking chair. They argued good-naturedly about names, unable to agree on anything. James wanted traditional family names. Hannah wanted something fresh and different. What about Jacob if it's a boy? James suggested one evening. Jacob Irving, that's a lot of hard consonants. Hannah wrinkled her nose. What's wrong with hard consonants? Nothing, I just want something that flows better. What about Joseph? Joseph's good, I like Joseph. James considered it. Joseph Irving, yeah, that works. What about if it's a girl? I like Grace, or maybe Catherine. Catherine Irving. James tested it out. That's pretty, I like that. They settled on Joseph for a boy and Catherine for a girl, though Hannah secretly hoped for a girl. She wanted a daughter, someone to teach and guide, someone who wouldn't have to face the world as alone as she had. In August, Hannah's old neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, came out to visit, bringing fabric for baby clothes and her own experienced advice. She stayed for supper, and Hannah realized how nice it was to have female company, someone to talk to about the realities of pregnancy and childbirth. You're lucky in your husband, Mrs. Patterson said as they sat on the porch shelling peas while James worked in the barn. James Irving is a good man, patient and kind. Not all women get that lucky in a marriage. I know, Hannah said softly. Believe me, I know how lucky I am. And he's lucky in you too. You've made a real home here. I remember when this was just a cabin and a dream. Now look at it, thriving. Hannah looked around at the ranch, seeing it through Mrs. Patterson's eyes. The cabin with its curtains and flower boxes, the garden bursting with vegetables, the barn and corrals well maintained and organized, the cattle fat and healthy in the pasture. They had built something real and lasting. September brought cooler weather and the first hints of autumn color in the trees along the creek. Hannah's belly had grown round and prominent, and she felt the baby move frequently now, strong kicks and rolls that made her gasp and laugh. James loved to feel the baby move. He'd put his hand on her belly and wait patiently until he felt a kick, then grin like a child with a new toy. "Strong baby," he'd say proudly, "going to be a fighter." "Just like us," Hannah would reply. One night in early October, Hannah woke with a backache that wouldn't ease no matter how she positioned herself. She got up and walked around the cabin, trying to work out the stiffness, but the ache persisted. By morning, it had developed into regular pains that wrapped around her belly and took her breath away. "The baby's coming," she told James, who immediately went pale. "Now, but it's early. The doctor said late October. Babies come when they're ready, not when doctors predict." Hannah gripped the back of a chair as another pain rolled through her. "You need to ride to town and get Mrs. Patterson. She's helped with births before." James looked torn between not wanting to leave her and knowing he needed to get help. "Will you be all right alone?" "I'll be fine. Just hurry." He rode like the devil himself was chasing him, and returned in record time with Mrs. Patterson and the doctor both. By then, Hannah's pains were coming hard and fast, and she was beginning to understand why women sometimes didn't survive childbirth. The labor lasted through the day and into the night. Mrs. Patterson stayed by Hannah's side, coaching her through the pains, while the doctor monitored both mother and baby. James paced outside, not allowed in the bedroom, wearing a path in the cabin floor with his worried walking. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, Hannah gave one last tremendous push and felt the baby slide free. A moment of silence, then a lusty wail filled the cabin. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, wrapping the baby in a clean cloth. "A healthy baby girl, Mrs. Patterson cleaned the baby while the doctor tended to Hannah, then placed the tiny bundle in her arms. Hannah looked down at her daughter's red, wrinkled face and felt her heart expand in a way she hadn't known was possible. "James," she called weakly, "come meet your daughter." James burst through the door, his face haggard with worry. But when he saw Hannah holding the baby, all the worry melted into wonder. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter with awe. "She's so small," he whispered. "She's perfect," Hannah corrected. "Catherine." "Our Catherine." James touched one tiny hand with his finger and the baby's fingers curled around it instinctively. "Hello, Catherine," he said softly. "I'm your papa. I'm going to take such good care of you." Hannah watched her husband fall in love with their daughter and felt tears slide down her cheeks. Happy tears, for once. Tears of joy and gratitude and overwhelming love. The doctor and Mrs. Patterson left after making sure both mother and baby were stable. James refused to leave Hannah's side, sleeping in the rocking chair beside the bed, so he could be there if either of them needed him. The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting in ways Hannah hadn't anticipated. Catherine was a hungry baby who wanted to nurse constantly. She slept in short bursts, which meant Hannah and James slept in short bursts too. The cabin that had seemed cozy now felt cramped with diapers and baby clothes drying by the stove, but through the exhaustion, There was joy, Catherine's first smile, the way she'd quiet when James sang to her in his rough, off-key voice, the feeling of her tiny weight in Hannah's arms, so helpless and trusting. James was an involved father in a way that surprised some of their neighbors, but didn't surprise Hannah at all. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Catherine when she was fussy, and talked to her constantly even though she was too young to understand. "You've got to tell them everything," he explained to Hannah when she teased him about his one-sided conversations with their daughter. That's how they learn to talk, by hearing words. Winter came again, their second winter together, and this time they faced it as a family of 3. James had added onto the cabin over the summer, creating a small additional room for Catherine. It wasn't much, but it gave them a bit more space and privacy. On Christmas morning, Catherine was 3 months old and just beginning to notice the world around her. James had carved her a set of wooden blocks, and Hannah had sewn her a rag doll. They sat together on the floor by the fireplace, watching their daughter try to grab the colorful blocks, and Hannah felt a peace she'd never known before. 2 years ago, I was alone and terrified, she said quietly. Now I have everything I ever wanted and things I didn't even know to want. James pulled her close, careful not to disturb Catherine. 2 years ago, I was alone in this cabin wondering if I'd ever have a real family, wondering if anyone would ever want to build a life with me. And then you were standing outside that bank looking like the whole world had ended, and I knew I had to at least try. I'm so glad you did. I'm so glad you sat down with me and asked me what I needed. Best decision I ever made." James kissed her temple. "You and Catherine, you're my whole world now. Everything I do is for you too." "We're a team," Hannah said. "Partners. That's what you promised me. And I've kept that promise, haven't I? Every single day." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and hard work. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. They added more cattle, built a larger barn, expanded the cabin again when Hannah became pregnant with their second child. A son this time, born in the spring of 1886, and named Joseph as they'd discussed years before. Catherine adored her baby brother, helping Hannah care for him with the serious devotion of a 3-year-old. James taught her to ride on a gentle mare, and she took to it naturally, fearless in a way that both thrilled and terrified her parents. Hannah had moments, usually late at night when the house was quiet and everyone else was sleeping, when she thought about her first family. Her parents and Samuel. The grief had faded to a gentle ache, no longer the sharp cutting pain it had once been. She hoped they would be proud of the life she'd built, the family she'd created. One evening in the summer of 1887, as they sat on the porch watching Catherine and Joseph play in the yard, James brought up something he'd been thinking about. "I want to clear the mortgage on this place. Pay off the bank completely." Hannah looked at him in surprise. "Can we afford that? If we're careful with money for the next year or so, yes. I've been putting aside extra when I can. The cattle sales have been good. I want to own this land free and clear, no debt hanging over us." "Then let's do it." Hannah took his hand. "Let's make this place truly ours." They worked toward that goal with determination. Hannah took in sewing and laundry from some of the other ranchers' wives, adding her earnings to their savings. James hired himself out for breaking horses, a skill he'd always had but hadn't advertised. Every spare dollar went into the fund to pay off the mortgage. By the spring of 1888, they had enough. James rode to White River with a bank draft for the full remaining balance on the loan, and came home with the deed to the property, marked "paid in full." That night, they celebrated with the children, though Catherine and Joseph were too young to fully understand what it meant. But Hannah and James understood. They owned their home, their land, their future. Nobody could take it away from them now. We did it, James said, holding the deed in his hands like it was made of gold. This is really ours. We did it together. Hannah leaned against his shoulder. Everything we have, we built together. Life continued to bring challenges. There were droughts that threatened the cattle and storms that damaged the barn. There were illnesses and injuries and moments of fear. But through it all, Hannah and James faced everything as partners, supporting each other, loving each other, building their life one day at a time. In 1889, Hannah gave birth to their third child, another daughter they named Margaret. The cabin was getting crowded with 3 children, so James began planning a real house, something bigger and more permanent. It took 2 years of planning and saving and working, but in 1891, they moved into a proper 2-story house with 4 bedrooms and a real parlor. Catherine, now 8 years old, got her own room for the first time. Joseph, at 5, was thrilled to share a room with his best friend and playmate. Baby Margaret had a nursery that connected to Hannah and James's bedroom. The night they moved in, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, Hannah and James stood in their bedroom and looked around in wonder. "Remember that little cabin," Hannah said, "when you first brought me here and I was so scared and uncertain? I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever met. Still think that." Hannah turned to face him, this man who'd given her everything. He was older now, lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, his hair starting to show threads of silver. But to her, he was as handsome as the day he'd sat down next to her on that bench in White River. "I love you, James Irving. I loved you then, though I didn't know it yet. I love you now. I'll love you until the day I die." James cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. "I saw you that day and something in me just knew. Knew you were supposed to be mine. Knew we were supposed to build this life together. And I've never been more grateful for anything than I am for the fact that you said yes." They kissed, deep and sweet, a reaffirmation of vows spoken years ago and kept faithfully every day since. The years continued to roll by. Catherine grew into a strong, capable young woman who could rope and ride as well as any man. Joseph developed his father's patient way with animals and his mother's head for numbers. Margaret was the wild one, fearless and laughing, always into some kind of mischief. In 1895, Hannah gave birth to their 4th and final child, a son they named Samuel after Hannah's brother. It felt right to give her lost brother's name to this bright, happy baby who filled their home with joy. James had succeeded in building the cattle empire that Hannah's father had only dreamed about. The ranch employed several hands now, men who lived in a bunkhouse James had built and who respected him as a fair but firm boss. The Irving name was known throughout the region as synonymous with quality cattle and honest dealing. But despite their success, James and Hannah never forgot where they'd come from. They helped young couples just starting out, offering advice and sometimes financial assistance. They took in orphans to work on the ranch, giving them the same chance James had been given years ago. They were known as generous and kind, people who'd been blessed and were determined to share those blessings. One day in the summer of 1898, Hannah was working in her garden when a young woman approached, leading a tired-looking horse. She was thin and dusty, her dress faded and mended in several places. She reminded Hannah of someone, though it took a moment to place the memory, herself, 15 years ago, standing outside the bank with nothing. "Can I help you?" Hannah asked, straightening up and wiping dirt from her hands. The young woman looked nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you, madam. I heard in town that the Irvings sometimes hire help. I can work hard. I can cook and clean and help with animals. I don't need much, just a place to stay and enough to save for a fresh start." Hannah's heart went out to her immediately. "What's your name?" Lucy Morrison. Well, Lucy Morrison, let me get my husband and we'll see what we can do. Hannah led her toward the house, already planning in her mind. They didn't really need more help, but they could make room. They could give this girl a chance, just as someone had once given Hannah a chance. James came out of the barn when Hannah called, took one look at the situation, and his eyes met Hannah's with understanding. They were thinking the same thing. "We can use help in the house," James said to Lucy. "The pay's fair and the work's honest. You'll have a room of your own and meals with the family. If that suits you, the job's yours." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. Thank you so much. I promise you won't regret it." After Lucy had been shown to her room and given a meal, James found Hannah in their bedroom. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. "That 15 years ago, that was me." "Yeah." James pulled her into his arms. "And I'm thinking how grateful I am that I was in the right place at the right time to help you. Maybe we can do the same for her. Maybe we can." Hannah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We've been given so much. It's only right to share it." Lucy proved to be as hardworking as she'd promised. Over time, she became part of the family, helping Hannah with the younger children and the household tasks. She was there 2 years later when Catherine, at 18, married the son of a neighboring rancher in a wedding that drew people from 3 counties. Hannah watched her daughter speak her vows and remembered her own wedding, so small and quick, born of necessity rather than choice. But it had grown into love, real and lasting. She hoped the same for Catherine, who was marrying for love from the start. "Our baby's all grown up," James said quietly, standing beside Hannah at the wedding reception. "I know. It happened so fast. They all grow up fast." James looked across the yard where Joseph was dancing with one of the neighbor girls, where Margaret was spinning little Samuel around until they were both dizzy and laughing. "But we've still got time with the others. We have time with Catherine, too. She's only moving 10 miles away. We'll see her often. It's not the same." Hannah squeezed his hand. "No, it's not, but it's how it's supposed to be. We raise them and love them, and then we let them build their own lives, just like we did." The turn of the century came, bringing with it new technologies and new ways of life. The railroad expanded, bringing more people to South Dakota. Towns grew larger. The wild frontier days were fading into memory and legend, but on the Irving Ranch, some things stayed the same. Hard work, family dinners, laughter and love. James and Hannah, now in their 40s, still worked side by side, still made decisions together, still fell into bed each night exhausted and grateful. In 1902, Catherine gave birth to Hannah and James's first grandchild, a girl named Rose. Hannah held her granddaughter and felt the circle of life continuing, generation to generation. "She looks like you," James said, peering at the baby's tiny face. "You think so? I know so. Same determined chin." He grinned. "Poor kid, she's going to be stubborn as all get out." Hannah laughed and passed the baby to her grandfather, watching as James's whole face softened with love. He'd been an amazing father. She knew he'd be an equally amazing grandfather. Joseph married in 1904, choosing a sweet-natured girl from town who loved books and learning. They built a house on the western edge of the ranch property, keeping the family close. Margaret showed no interest in settling down, declaring she was going to see the world first. She left for Denver in 1905 to attend a women's college, breaking her mother's heart and making her proud in equal measure. Samuel, the youngest, was turning into a serious young man with his mother's business sense and his father's integrity. At 15, he was already helping manage the ranch accounts and making suggestions that improved their operations. One evening in 1906, Hannah and James sat on the porch of the house they'd built together, watching the sun set over land they owned free and clear. Their children were grown or nearly so. Their grandchildren played in the yard. The ranch was thriving. They had built something that would last beyond their own lives. "Do you ever think about that day?" Hannah asked quietly. "When you found me outside the bank?" "Sometimes. I think about how close I came to just riding past, minding my own business." James shook his head. "Would have been the biggest mistake of my life. Mine too. If I hadn't accepted your offer, if I'd been too proud or too scared." Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder. "My whole life would have been different. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me so quickly, not having a choice really?" Hannah sat up to look at him properly, surprised by the question. "Never, not once. You gave me everything I needed when I had nothing. And then you gave me everything I didn't even know I wanted. Love, partnership, family, a home. How could I possibly regret that? I just wanted to make sure. Sometimes I think about how desperate you must have been, and I worry that maybe you would have chosen different if you'd had more options." "James Irving, look at me." Hannah took his face in her hands. "I was desperate, that's true. I was about to break under all of it, all the grief and fear and loss. And you sat down and said, 'Tell me everything you need.' Nobody had ever done that for me before. Nobody had ever really listened. And then you offered me a way forward, and I took it because it felt right. Not just necessary, but right." "You felt right to me too," James admitted. "From that first moment. We saved each other," Hannah said softly. "You gave me security and a home. I gave you partnership and family. And we both gave each other love. Real, lasting, growing love." James pulled her close, and they sat together as the sky darkened and the stars came out, the same stars they'd watched together for over 20 years now. Life continued its forward march. More grandchildren arrived. The ranch adapted to new methods and technologies while keeping its core values. James taught his sons and grandsons about caring for the land and the animals. Hannah taught her daughters and granddaughters about strength and resilience and the importance of partnership in marriage. In 1910, they celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary with a party that filled the house and yard with family and friends. Catherine came with her 4 children. Joseph brought his 2. Margaret, visiting from Denver where she now worked as a teacher, brought stories of city life that fascinated the younger children. Samuel, now 22 and courting a girl from White River, was already planning his own wedding for the next year. Hannah looked around at all these people, all this life that had sprung from that desperate decision she'd made on a dusty sidewalk in 1883, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Happy?" James asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Happier than I have any right to be." "You have every right," he kissed her cheek. "You've earned every bit of happiness you have." That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, they lay in bed together, hands clasped between them. 27 years, Hannah mused, more than half my life. Best 27 years of mine. James brought her hand to his lips, and I'm looking forward to the next 27. Getting ambitious in our old age, are we? We're not old, we're experienced. He grinned at her in the darkness. "And I intend to experience a lot more years with you." They did exactly that. Through the 1910s and into the 1920s, they watched their children raise their own children, watched the ranch continue to grow and thrive, watched the world change around them while their love remained constant. There were sorrows along the way. Friends and family members passed. The Great War touched their lives when Joseph's oldest son went to fight in Europe. Economic downturns threatened their stability, but they weathered it all together, just as they always had. In 1923, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 60s now, their hair silver, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But when Hannah looked at James, she still saw the young man who'd offered her hope when she had none. And when James looked at Hannah, he still saw the brave woman who'd taken a chance on a stranger and built a life with him. 40 years, James said, echoing Hannah's words from all those anniversaries ago. That's a lifetime. It's our lifetime, Hannah corrected. And I wouldn't change a single day of it. They stood together on the porch of the house they'd built, looking out over the land they'd worked, surrounded by the family they'd created. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. A whole legacy built on love and partnership, and the simple act of one person asking another what they needed, and then doing everything in their power to provide it. I love you, Hannah Irving, James said, the same words he'd spoken countless times over the past 40 years. I love you too, James Irving, Hannah replied, the same words she'd spoken countless times in return. And as the sun set over the South Dakota prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, they stood together, these two people who'd found each other at their lowest points and lifted each other to heights they'd never dreamed possible. Two people who'd taken a practical arrangement and turned it into the greatest love story of their lives. The years continued to pass gently for James and Hannah. By 1928, they had both reached their late 60s and had finally agreed to slow down, letting Samuel run the day-to-day operations of the ranch while they enjoyed a more relaxed pace of life. They spent their days tending a small garden, entertaining visits from their ever-growing horde of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and sitting on their porch watching the world go by. One warm afternoon in May, Hannah was shelling peas when Lucy Morrison, now Lucy Matthews, and married to one of their former ranch hands, came to visit with her own children. They sat together on the porch, their hands busy with work while their voices carried on the easy conversation of old friends. You know, Lucy said, I never properly thanked you for taking me in all those years ago. I was at the end of my rope, just like you'd been when you first came here. Hannah smiled, her fingers working automatically to split the pea pods. You thanked us plenty, Lucy, and you more than earned your place here. You became family. I always wondered what made you so willing to help a stranger. Now I know. Someone did the same for you once. James did, yes. And we both remembered what it felt like to be desperate and afraid. We wanted to pass on the kindness we'd been shown. Lucy's youngest daughter ran past chasing one of Hannah's great-grandchildren, their laughter bright in the afternoon air. You've built something amazing here. Not just the ranch, but the family, the legacy. It wasn't just us. It was everyone who came after, everyone who added their own love and work to what we started. Hannah set aside the bowl of peas and looked at her friend. But you're right that it started with kindness. With James seeing someone who needed help and offering it without expecting anything in return. He got plenty in return, though, Lucy pointed out with a knowing smile. He got you, Hannah laughed. Well, that's true enough. We saved each other, really. I needed security and a home. He needed partnership and family. And somehow, in meeting those practical needs, we found love. Real, deep, lasting love. James came around the corner of the house just then, moving a bit slower than he used to but still strong and steady. Are you ladies talking about me? Always, Hannah said, her eyes twinkling. We were just discussing what a lucky man you are. Luckiest man alive, James agreed, settling into the chair beside Hannah. Though I'd argue my wife is equally lucky to have me. Equally lucky, Hannah confirmed, reaching over to take his hand. We're both blessed beyond measure. They sat together, hands linked, watching the children play and the sun track across the sky. This was their life now, peaceful, full, rich with love and family and memories. That evening, after Lucy had taken her children home and the ranch had settled into its nighttime quiet, Hannah and James prepared for bed. It was a ritual they'd performed thousands of times, so familiar and comfortable that they moved in perfect synchronization. As they settled under the covers, James pulled Hannah close the way he had every night for 45 years. She fit against his side perfectly, her head on his shoulder, her hand over his heart. "James," she said softly, do you remember what you said to me that first day? When we sat on that bench outside the hotel. I remember every word. I said I was looking for a partner, someone who understood what it took to build something from nothing. You also said you'd treat me with respect, work beside me, make sure I always had what I needed. That you'd never raise a hand to me or speak cruel words. James pressed a kiss to her forehead, and I kept that promise. Every single day, Hannah agreed. You've been exactly the partner you promised to be, more than that. You've been my best friend, my lover, the father of my children, my companion in all things. You've been all that for me too. James's voice was thick with emotion. You took a chance on a near stranger and gave me everything I'd ever wanted, a real family. A home that was more than just walls and a roof. Love. They lay quietly for a moment, listening to each other breathe, feeling each other's heartbeat. "I'm grateful," Hannah whispered, "for every day, every moment, even the hard times, because we faced them together." "Me too, love, me too." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, exactly as they'd done for more than 16,000 nights before. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and built the best of lives. As the 1930s arrived, bringing with them economic hardship across the nation, the Irving Ranch stood strong. The careful management and debt-free status that James and Hannah had worked so hard to achieve protected them from the worst of the Depression's effects. They were able to help struggling neighbors, offering work when they could, sharing food from their abundant garden and livestock. Samuel and his wife ran the ranch with the same integrity and partnership that his parents had modeled. Catherine's children were grown now, starting families of their own. Joseph's oldest son had returned safely from the war and was teaching at the local school. Margaret, after her years in Denver, had returned to South Dakota with her husband and settled on a small ranch of their own not far from the family homestead. The Irving family had become a cornerstone of the community, known for their fairness, generosity, and the obvious love that bound them together. People would point to James and Hannah as an example of what marriage should be: partnership and respect and genuine affection that only deepened with time. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1933, the family threw a celebration that brought people from across the state. James and Hannah, now in their early 70s, sat in places of honor while friends and family toasted them, told stories, and celebrated a love that had endured for half a century. Catherine stood to speak, her voice carrying across the crowded room. "When I was a little girl, I remember asking my mother how she knew she loved my father. She told me that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice you made every day. A choice to be kind, to listen, to support, to forgive, to stay when things got hard. I've watched my parents make that choice every single day of their marriage, and it's taught me everything I know about what real love looks like." Joseph spoke next. "My father told me once that the measure of a man isn't what he achieves when everything's going well, but how he treats people when times are hard. He said that's how he knew my mother was special, because when her whole world had fallen apart, she didn't become bitter or cruel. She stayed kind. And he said that when you find someone like that, you hold on tight and never let go. Well, Pa, you held on, and we're all here because of it." One by one, Children and grandchildren and friends stood to share what James and Hannah's love had meant to them, how it had shaped their own lives and relationships. By the time everyone had finished speaking, both James and Hannah had tears streaming down their faces. James stood slowly, his hand gripping Hannah's for support and comfort. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "But I want to say something about this woman here. 50 years ago, I saw her standing outside a bank looking like the whole world had ended. And maybe it had for her. She'd lost everything. But instead of giving up, instead of letting that break her, she took a chance on a stranger's offer. She came out to a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere and agreed to build a life with me." He looked down at Hannah, his eyes shining with love. "I thought I was doing her a favor, thought I was offering her security and safety. Turns out she gave me everything. She turned that cabin into a home. She gave me children who make me proud every single day. She's been my partner in every sense of the word, working beside me, making decisions with me, holding me up when I faltered and celebrating with me when we succeeded." James paused, swallowing hard. "I love this woman more today than I did 50 years ago. And I loved her pretty fierce even then, though I didn't have the words for it yet. She's been my whole world for half a century, and God willing, she'll be my whole world for however many years we have left." Hannah stood then, leaning against James for support. "You all know my story. You know, I came to this marriage out of desperation and necessity. What you might not know is how quickly that changed. How this man who barely knew me treated me with more respect and kindness than I'd ever known. How he listened when I needed to talk, held me when I needed comfort, gave me space when I needed time." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "James asked me once what I needed, and then he spent the next 50 years making sure I had it. But somewhere along the way, what I needed changed. I needed his laugh, his touch, his presence beside me in bed every night. I needed his steady strength when the world felt chaotic. I needed his dreams and his fears and his hopes. I needed him, all of him, not just what he could provide, but who he was." She turned to face James fully, taking both his hands in hers. "You saved my life that day in White River, but you did more than that. You gave me a life worth living. You gave me love worth having, and I am grateful for every single day we've had together." They kissed then, to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered. A kiss that held 50 years of love and partnership, of trials weathered and joys celebrated, of a promise made and kept. The party continued late into the night, but eventually James and Hannah made their way back to their bedroom, exhausted but happy. They prepared for bed in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of long practice. As they settled under the covers, Hannah sighed contentedly. 50 years, 50 years, James echoed, and you know what? It feels like it went by in a blink, and also like we've been together forever. I know exactly what you mean. Hannah snuggled closer. I can barely remember what life was like before you. It feels like you've always been there. I always will be there as long as I'm breathing. They lay quietly, listening to the sounds of the night, the familiar creaks of the house settling, the distant call of an owl. "James," Hannah said after a while. "Yeah, love, thank you for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for offering me a chance when I had none, for loving me even when I was too broken to love myself. Hannah, you were never broken. You were bent, maybe, weathered, but never broken. Your strength was always there, just waiting for a chance to show itself." He kissed her temple. "Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on me, for building this beautiful life with me. There's nowhere else I'd rather have been, nothing else I'd rather have done. This life with you, it's been everything." They fell asleep holding each other, two people who'd found each other in the darkness and created light together. Two people who'd proven that love could grow from the smallest seeds if tended with care and commitment. The years after their 50th anniversary were gentle ones. James and Hannah spent their days in quiet contentment, tending their garden, playing with great-grandchildren, and enjoying the fruits of the life they'd built. They moved a bit slower, tired a bit easier, but the love between them never diminished. In 1936, James's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just increasing fatigue and occasional shortness of breath. The doctor diagnosed a weak heart and prescribed rest and limited activity. James grumbled about being forced to slow down even more, but Hannah was firm. "You've worked hard your whole life," she told him. "Now it's time to rest and let others do the heavy lifting. I don't like being useless." "You're not useless. You're my husband and you're resting so you can be around for a good long while yet. That's your job now." James took her hand and brought it to his lips. "Yes, madam. Always did like following your orders." Hannah cared for him tenderly, adjusting their routine to accommodate his limitations. They spent long afternoons on the porch, James dozing in his chair while Hannah read or sewed. Sometimes they'd talk about the past, remembering their early days together, the building of the ranch, the birth of each child. "We had a good run," James said one evening as they watched the sunset. "We're still having a good run," Hannah corrected firmly. "Don't talk like it's over." "Not over. Just thinking about how lucky I've been." He looked at her, his eyes still that same blue-gray that had caught her attention 53 years ago. "I got to spend my life with the love of my life. Not everyone can say that." "I got the same gift," Hannah said softly. "You were the love of my life, too. Are the love of my life. Present tense, James Irving, don't you forget it." He smiled and squeezed her hand. "Present tense. Got it." James passed away peacefully in his sleep in November of 1936, just a few weeks after their 53rd wedding anniversary. Hannah woke that morning to find him still beside her, his hand still holding hers, his face peaceful and calm. He'd gone quietly, without pain or fear, just slipped away in the night. The grief was profound, even though Hannah had known it was coming. She'd lost half of herself, the partner who'd walked beside her for more than half a century. The man who'd saved her and loved her and built a life with her. But even in her grief, she wasn't alone. Her children surrounded her, holding her up the way she and James had held each other up for so many years. The ranch continued to run smoothly under Samuel's management. The family that she and James had created continued to grow and thrive. At the funeral, which was attended by hundreds of people from across the state, Hannah stood beside the grave and spoke about her husband. "James Irving was the best man I ever knew," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He took a chance on a desperate woman with nothing to offer, and he loved her faithfully for 53 years. He built this ranch with his own 2 hands. He raised 4 children to be good, honest, hard-working people. He helped countless others along the way, always offering a hand up to those who needed it." She paused, looking at the faces of her children and grandchildren, seeing James reflected in each of them. "He told me once that he was the lucky one, but he was wrong. I was lucky. Lucky that he saw me that day in White River. Lucky that he offered me a partnership. Lucky that he loved me the way he did. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will never regret a single moment we had together." Hannah lived for 8 more years after James's death, staying in the house they'd built together, surrounded by family and memories. She watched more great-grandchildren be born, saw the ranch continue to prosper, and took comfort in knowing that what she and James had built would last long after they were both gone. She spoke often about James to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive with stories and laughter. She never remarried, never even considered it. James had been her one great love, and she was content to honor that for the rest of her days. On a warm spring morning in 1944, Hannah passed away quietly in her sleep, just as James had. She was 83 years old, had lived a full and rich life, and had loved and been loved beyond measure. Her children buried her beside James, beneath a headstone that read Hannah and James Irving, partners in life and love, together forever. The ranch continued for generations after them, run by descendants who remembered the story of their beginning. The story of a woman who was about to break under the weight of her grief and loss, and a cowboy who sat down beside her and asked her to tell him everything she needed. The story of how they saved each other and built something that lasted beyond their own lives. People in White River still told the story decades later, using it as an example of what love could be, when it was built on respect and partnership and genuine care for another person. Teachers used it to illustrate the power of kindness to strangers. Preachers used it in wedding sermons to talk about the true meaning of marriage. But for the Irving family, it was simply the story of their grandparents and great-grandparents, the two people who had started it all with a simple question and a willingness to help. Two people who had taken the worst circumstances and turned them into the best life. Two people who had proven that love could grow anywhere if given the chance. And on quiet evenings, when the family gathered on the porch of the house that James had built and Hannah had made a home, they would tell the story again. How she stood outside that bank with nothing, how he offered her everything, how they built a life together from the ground up. How they loved each other through 53 years of marriage and beyond, into whatever came after. It was a love story for the ages. But more than that, it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories start with the simplest act of kindness. With one person seeing another person's need and doing everything in their power to meet it. With partnership and respect and a willingness to build something together, one day at a time. James and Hannah Irving's legacy lived on not just in the ranch that bore their name or the descendants who carried their blood, but in the example they'd set. An example of what marriage could be when two people truly chose each other, every day for better or worse, in plenty and in want. An example of love that lasted, love that grew, love that transformed two desperate people into partners who built an empire of family and prosperity. Their story became legend, but it had been real. Two people, one chance meeting, one question asked and answered. Everything that came after, 53 years of marriage and a legacy that would last for generations, all of it grew from that one moment when a cowboy sat down beside a desperate woman and said, "Tell me everything you need." And she did, and he listened. And together, they built a love story that would never be forgotten.